Okay, so now I'm delighted and happy and honored to welcome or to introduce Caroline Nobo, who's going to be our first speaker and promise to get us started with a lot of excitement. So following a rich and diverse career, Caroline is a research scholar in law and executive director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School, where she provides strategic direction and leadership to the Justice Collaboratory's unique network of interdisciplinary scholars and staff. In addition, Caroline sits on the board of the Connecticut nonprofit serving incarcerated parents and their children, and is a member of her town council ethics committee. Some of her areas of expertise include policing, gun violence, community-based research methodologies, and the progressive prosecutor movement. So with that, I want to welcome you.
Great, awesome. All right, good morning. Thank you so much for having me kick off this symposium. I am sure you're wondering why a criminologist who works at a law school and runs a social science center is standing in front of a bunch of computer scientists. And
not at all. The conference is about.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was also thinking about that all night. And, I think my goal today is I just want to take you a little bit out of your knowledge comfort zone and talk about sort of a part of American life where social justice and technology are intersecting constantly, and where there's just a lot of work left to be done. As far as the vibe for today, I'm just really going to lecture. I don't have much PowerPoints. I'm going to show you a couple websites that are examples of what I'm going to talk about, but we'll mainly just chat. Please feel free to ask questions. I'll start my timer. I teach, so if you guys want to interrupt me and ask questions, that's fine, or we can wait till the end. Yeah. Oh yeah, I wasn't sure with sometimes, the speaker.
Thank you so much.
Lip reading and all that jazz. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, I want to tell you also a little bit about the Collaboratory because I think it's very important for this sort of conversation. It's an interdisciplinary research center. Even though we are sort of social science focused, we're embedded in the law school. And the thing that's very unique is that we work collaboratively with medical doctors, historians, we have a poet, philosophers, lawyers. And the goal here, and what it's really taught me, is this value of having diverse perspectives and different backgrounds come together to, hopefully sort of solve the same problem, which is what seems basically is the point of this conference today. So, let me just start by trying to define the problem for you. People really love to talk about America's criminal justice system, the system. Well, that's not true. The truth is that we have a little over 3,000 criminal justice systems in America. We have 3,100 counties. Every single county pretty much has its own judge, its own prosecutor, its own sheriff. So what happens is that criminal justice in America becomes this extremely siloed and local problem. We have 18,000 police departments. We have 13,000 courts and upwards of 7,000 prisons and jails. And they pretty much all use different software and technology and product to manage what is going on in their office. And so we just end up, with this big criminal justice data transparency infrastructure problem. It makes it very difficult to ask super basic questions about criminal legal reform in America. These systems are built to track people and to track cases. They are not meant to inform policy. They are not meant to inform, social change. We're going to talk a lot about this. The product design is informed by very outdated normative values of the agency. And we'll go into that more. The people who are working in the agencies, designing the product, the engineers are also, they're not typically trained on social science, right? And they're not thinking about the goal and the design of the product and how to build innovative ones. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, it's also just a big money business, right? And it caters to the users, which are the courts, the cops. It does not cater to the general public or to the populations most impacted by criminal justice policy. So I want to talk a little bit about what criminal justice technology looks like. You're probably wondering. So the most typical way to talk about this is what we would just call case management software, or CMS. That's like a lot of the language we use. And as we mentioned, they're usually all different for every county players. You know, sometimes we get lucky and you'll get a county that's like particularly well-funded, particularly progressive. And, you know, they'll have an integrated data system where the courts and the cops and everyone talks to each other. And we actually see some like cool policy causation when that happens, which I'll talk more about. So, you know, the prosecutor, the court, the cop, the jail, the defender, probation, they all have their own technology. You get the point. And, you know, I want to talk a lot about theory of change today and what is the theory of change when we build. And, you know, I always say, why don't all these systems speak to each other? Like that's like this basic theory to me that they should. And in places where they do speak well, we see a lot of ripple effects. And normally the county agencies work together better on policy when their data systems talk, right? It seems like this very obvious thing, but there's already this embedded idea of trust and fairness and transparency and sharing with data. So then when it comes time to use that data for some policy change, they're sort of like all on the same page already. It's very rare to have public facing dashboards of the data. Like, so normally this stuff is extremely internal. This is getting more and more popular and is like not without a whole other host of problems. But, you know, we have this very siloed data. It's extremely local. It's not accessible, and it is designed to track people. And that's about it, right? And then we're trying to use it to inform a, you know, massive coming together of criminal justice reform in the country. And it's just like, we've got this big disconnect between the two things.
Clarification.
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand. What is it that's just designed to track people?
The criminal legal system technologies, like every, you know, the prison is about who comes in, who comes out, right? You know, the court is like, who's on the docket, was the case disposed? There's nothing saying, you know, was this person treated fairly today? Right? It's strictly about let's movement track certain specific outcomes. And then we have a criminal justice system, right? And then we have the whole group of technologists and engineers that are building the software that runs our criminal justice system, okay? This is almost predominant, almost the majority are for-profit software vendors, right? It's a very small group of private vendors who build and sell this software. Some are very large, like Tyler Technologies, and keep eating up other people. It's a very lucrative market. If you want to custom build something, you know, a report, say you want to start measuring something, it is tens of thousands of dollars. And if you want a whole new data system, new way of tracking information, we're talking easily 250,000 or more. So if you're a local small agency and, you know, you're trying to fight crime, it's much easier to go to your town council and say, hey, I need $200K for guns versus I need a better information system and I need a social scientist to work with me to design it. They're going to be like, yeah, no, absolutely not. And no way does that happen today. So, you know, people are building some of what I'm going to use the term today called decarceral, right? Which is basically the inverse of incarceration, right? Which is that our system has sort of been designed to people in prison. And there is a group of people who are now decarceral, designing policies and technologies to keep people out of our system. So I'm going to show you them. They're very cool. There is a group of technologists and engineers who are doing their own small startups, and they are building decarceral technologies, okay? You know, one I want to talk about today is called Recidiviz, which is, you know, they're funded primarily by private donors, and they work across the entire the entire scope of the system. So from, probation, arrest, all the way to post-incarceration. And the goal is to design tools that bring sort of real-time insight into what's working. Now, this is kind of a cool story because their founder, Clementine Jacoby, she was a Google product engineer. And Google sort of did this like free little project on the side. She ended up leaving Google, starting this nonprofit that's all about sort of infusing theory and social science into criminal justice data softwares. Now, this is really important because it once takes me into a big arching goal I want us to talk to you about today, which is like who sets the normative value of these technologies. And, as a scientist, it's something we talk a lot about also with even like a randomized control trial. Like I'm like one of these people who's always like, oof, another RCT, but like who's designing the RCT and who says what we care about when we do an RCT and who's designing the algorithm and is there bias? And it's sort of this massive issue has just like trickled down through all of the software and all of the technology in the criminal legal system. So what's happened is that there is this very outdated, based on old norms, sort of paradigm of crime control in America, right? And if anyone's like studied criminal justice or crime, you might have heard this term deterrence, right? So deterrence means how do we stop crime from happening? The prevailing American theory is the severity and the certainty of punishment will stop people from committing crime. Okay, deterrent theory. And so the majority of the technologies that we use in criminal justice, the way we track things, are all based on deterrence, right? Like, how do we stop crime? How do we lower crime? How do we lower recidivism? All of these very basic measures. And that is the normative value, right? This is the norm on which we build our systems. It's not based on theory. It's not based on research. It's based on an American paradigm of incarceration. And that affects everything that happens as people track data and move around data and form policy. So that's sort of one issue, right? And sometimes these companies will have someone helping their engineers, helping their computer scientists, right? But it's typically someone in law enforcement. And again, it's not someone who's proximate to the problem. They're informing it in a very, very specific way. Computer science, engineering, the tech ecosystem at large is not a diverse one. And there are a lot of data protection standards that ban access to working with criminal justice data. So, I always talk about we need engineers, we need this field to be more diverse, and it'd be great if it could incorporate people proximate to the problem, formerly incarcerated individuals. But that's not a low bar. That's a very, very high bar, especially in this field, to start shifting the way we design technologies to be more diverse and include the norms of people who are very proximate to the problem of America's criminal legal system. I'm not going to go into it too much today, but I wanted to just take a second when we start talking about norms and values and how that influences, and just sort of talk about the bias that is embedded within criminal justice technologies. Based on sort of my quick review of the papers today, it looks like there's going to be some conversations about concepts of fairness, demographics, algorithms, and like I said, it's not my wheelhouse, but I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to acknowledge this is very much a known issue too in criminal legal work. There are all these risk assessments, crime predictors, and they all sort of tend to operate on some biased algorithmic foundations. From my experience, this is still very much an emerging focus of computer and data scientists, and this would be a ripe area for people wanting to work more in. So let's talk a little bit about how do we measure what matters and what would it look like to have a theoretically driven software in our criminal legal system. So we want to create new, better systems that measure new and better things. And then we need to incentivize people to measure and create these new systems. So we've talked about America's traditional paradigm of crime control and how the systems are built around these goals. An alternative would say there are better goals, And they should be about building a fairer system where trust is what we are measuring, right? So we talked about this prevailing paradigm of deterrence in America for crime control. And then there's a whole other one, right, which says the goal of our criminal legal system should not be to deter crime. It should be to foster trust between legal authority and the community. Okay, and if I view legal authority as legitimate, as fair, I'm actually more likely to cooperate in the law with the law versus deterrence, right? So people think, oh no, it's like way scarier to put people in prison. But what we've learned is that people say, no, actually, like if I just feel you have my best intentions at heart, if I find you fair, I'm more likely to cooperate. I'm more likely to obey the law. So why aren't we building systems that track that? Why aren't we building systems that incorporate that theory and measure those things? A great example is I've been working with this massive prosecutor's office, the Brooklyn DA. And they came to us and they said, listen, we really want to understand some bias in our plea bargaining process, right? We feel like certain people are offered and accept pleas way more than other people offer and accept pleas. The problem is our case management software just doesn't care about this. It doesn't track demographics. It doesn't track pleas. We have no way to track this. Can we partner with you and like someone at Yale and build a whole system that does this and is based on this theory of reducing disparities? And we're like, well, didn't you just pay $2 million for a new system? And they're like, yeah, they said they couldn't do that. And they didn't understand how they would do it anyway, because they don't have any social scientists working with them on the product side. So this is an example of sort of like in 2022, the sort of things that our systems should be thinking about when they're designing to measure trust, measure fairness. And it's a frustrating paradox. And this is where I really start to scratch my head, because when we think about criminal justice policy and reform, it's like not a space devoid of theory, right? Actually, it's a space, full of evidence, full of research, rigor, it's all there. and instead, we have these systems that have been predominantly built on the same sort of foundations for many, many years. So this creates a huge barrier to reform, right? Because it's hard to know what works and how to fix it if the software you used is tracking things that you don't like. Yeah.
Say something about what is trust and fairness.
Yeah, I'm actually.
Should be measured.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to talk a little bit about procedural justice theory and some examples of things in like a couple minutes. But I was telling you about Recidivist, this very cool tech company founded by Clementine. And Clementine uses this example about maps and how the idea of a map sort of changed as soon as we got smartphones, and how you could immediately know you were going the wrong way, right? Where before you could drive hundreds of miles and be like, I just never saw that. I don't think I'm going the right way. Now it's like we take, oh, no, I'm fine. I just need to turn around and go right now, right away. And this is sort of like the technology that's missing, right? Is this ability to know where we're going and know immediately when we've taken the wrong turn. So anyways, I love this story of Clementine and the map. It's a great idea to understand how we're very fragmented and it's very hard to see where we've been and where we're going. The other giant barrier to this is, again, there's no standard language, right? Even our criminal, a lot of people don't know this, even our like criminal penal code, it's different in every single state, right? So like how one state defines a charge or a crime, it's totally different to the state. And you can have, counties that border each other and their conceptions of justice and legality are totally different. And so again, it's very hard, right, to build. And this is what I want to actually make this point because it's very interesting. When you come to a giant company that is building products, they'll say, well, this is the problem, right? We can't build something that's cool and innovative because every place is so different, right? And it would cost us a fortune to do it. And I don't really have the answer to that problem, but this is like what they tell you is the problem, right? It's like, it's just too hard. The system's too fragmented. So let's think about the product and how do we connect the theory and the research to the creation of a technology and a product that works? I would say, first of all, we need to start, social scientists, groups like this need to start working with these criminal justice agencies and the software companies to train on social science that connects directly to their product, okay? I'm talking about like a mini college for engineers, computer scientists on the social science theory that drives criminal justice in this country, that drives criminal legal reform. Can we think about co-design models? I'm going to give you some example of companies that do have co-design models where they match the computer scientists and the engineers with social scientists to design the product. And I just really feel like there needs to be a way to embed a theoretical goal into these teams very early on and ask questions, what's the problem to be solved versus how do we track people moving? So you asked about how we measure trust and fairness. So I'm going to give you one, we're going to go into some examples now and start thinking about how you do this. So how would we design a software that tracks fairness? How would we, if we know the prevailing theory of how we get people to obey the law is that we are fair, that's the most way. How do we start software that encourages people to be more fair to build trustworthiness? So this is called procedural justice. This is the opposite theory to deterrence. And basically it says that if people view legal authority, criminal justice system as being neutral, all people are treated with respect and dignity, everyone is given a voice, and the decision makers convey trustworthy motives about those impacted by their decisions, then they will experience procedural justice and they will view their system as legitimate and fair. And this is what we think the goal of America's criminal justice system should be, okay? There's like many, many decades of research on this. We found that people who are treated with procedural justice, procedural fairness, even if they don't get the outcome they would have hoped for, they will respond that they are satisfied with the experience, even if they're found guilty or if they're a victim and their perpetrator is not incarcerated, they will say, I feel like I got what I needed out of this because my voice was heard. I felt the judge was neutral. I can walk away with a sense of fairness. And now I feel my system is legitimate and I'm more likely to cooperate in the future with my criminal legal system. So I was trying to think of some examples of how we could build procedural justice theory into software. So a great example is a prosecutor's office. Let's go to a very large prosecutor's office in a large county. They'll see tens of thousands, maybe 80,000 cases a year. And in that process, they need to be communicating with everyone because most people, unless you're involved in America's criminal legal system, you really have no idea what's happening. It's a real black box. It's very confusing. So what happens is victims sort of like float out in the world waiting for correspondence, waiting for someone to tell them what's happening. So what we could do is encourage a prosecutor's office to think about the theory of procedural justice, to think about that people just need to know what's happening. They need to understand, they need to have a voice, and then we'll probably have better outcomes in the end. So, right, we say, okay, prosecutors, we want you to design a victim outreach. We pair you with some engineers, computer scientists, and data scientists. We say, this is the goal. How can you incorporate better outreach to your victims? So maybe it's an app that tracks things like where you are in the process. Your charges were received. Your charges are being screened. Your charges have been submitted. We're going to call you in for victim testimony. This is your court date. This is what happens, right? They don't get any of this. Maybe there's a survey. Maybe we say there's a qualitative survey component. We want to understand how you're feeling about this process. How are you interacting? How do you perceive this office to be treating you right now? It might even include statistics on a judge. How often does your judge rule in favor of the victim in this? So you know what to anticipate. You can feel safe that your judge is being neutral, that this office is being neutral. And this would all be with the goal of elevating the trust and legitimacy of the prosecutor's office. So at the end, it's not about the prosecutor or the victim getting a guilty verdict. It's about centering the person, the victim, and the community at large. So can you see how we're moving away from how many people got arrested to, does my community feel like it's being treated with respect? And we have a relationship together around safety, a more holistic view of safety. So that was a hypothetical. But now I want to tell you about some cool companies that are doing this. I thought you guys would enjoy that. Okay, so, like I mentioned, there are examples of engineers, tech companies that are doing this, right? But it kind of drives me crazy because they are all small startup nonprofits that are funded predominantly by grants and public and private donors, okay? Versus someone like Tyler Technologies, which is a giant publicly traded hundreds of millions of dollars a company, and they really corner the market on this sort of technology. So this is UpTrust, which is just so great. And they were sort of the first in this space. And basically what they did is there was a lot of research that said, let me back up. A big problem in criminal justice is people just like not showing up for court. It is like this little thing that creates like massive ripple effects and like makes it takes forever for cases to get to resolve, blah, blah, blah. And a bunch of, researchers said, it's actually not rocket science. If you just remind them to come, they come. But no one ever built a technology around that, right? No one had ever embedded that. So these two guys said, we're just going to create a messaging app that is hardwired to a case management system. And it allows the criminal justice stakeholders to interact with the users of the system, right? And they have this like great like sort of theory of change here, which I love. That starts with customize, integrate, analyze, and then with the final goal of decarcerate, right? If we could get more people to just show up to their court hearing, they're not going to get a bench warrant. They're not going to end up in jail. And this has been successful with nearly 1 million people have used this software. So that's one example. Oh no, how do I make this go away so I can click the other ones? What? Oh, that's what it wants me to do. Okay. Goodness, being very. Okay, here's recidivism. And this is, I go back to what recidivist does. Okay, so then there's recidivism, right? And recidivists, and they do this thing where basically they're doing exactly what I'm talking about, right? So they've figured out, right, that we're tracking all of this data. It's all like siloed and messy, and like it's not actually getting to any of the goals that a lot of people care about in 2022. So they have created this like massive open source data platform that takes all of these systems, matches them, merges them, creates new metrics, puts them in a pretty platform, and gives them back to the counties. As you can, and this is Clementine's group. So Clementine is the former Google engineer who went and restarted this. And then I wanted to talk to you, I'm gonna like do a tiny digress and talk about other spaces that are doing this or starting to do this well. And one of them is social media governance. And the Justice Collaboratory has been working on the product side with places like Nextdoor, Facebook, Tinder, Twitter, Discord, and we sit with them and we say, listen, as we start designing online governance, can we root what we're talking about in the theory? So what Nextdoor did is sort of this model that I think would serve the criminal justice technologies very well, which is they created an advisory board, right? Because the whole goal, the theory of Nextdoor is to create community vitality, to create neighborhood cohesion, and they're designing all these products to do it. And then they said, well, oh crap, I don't really have any experts who know about community cohesion. So they created this group of academics, experts in all these different fields, social psychology, quality, civic engagement, and they meet and they come up with projects and they work with students, their students, like we're on this community advisory board. And then they let us help them design product with their trusted safety team. They test it, they roll it out, they come back and we keep workshopping it. So this is like very much a model of what it could look like in real life in the criminal justice space. And then this is another example. And I like this one because it's an example of how we can innovate on our current systems that are tried and true. But the question has changed. The theory behind it has changed. So has anyone here heard of CompStat? Is anyone familiar with this? Okay, so CompStat really came to rise, probably following like the '94 crime bill and this idea of community policing and accountability for cops, right? And so what they would do is they started tracking all these metrics, right? Like how many guns did you take away this week? How many beats did you walk? How many arrests did you make? And then they would track all of this data by officer and they put them in a big room once a month and they go through the CompStat statistics and they call people out. Officer Tony, why didn't you give any tickets last week? You know, and it had this like weird effect, right? Where it was like, it was kind of working, but then people were fudging numbers, but it stuck around and people still use CompStat as a way to internally manage the performance of an agency. But as we've talked about, our goals have shifted. So the Center for Policing Equity, which was founded and run by a social psychologist, has started developing technologies and innovating on current technologies that change the goal, right? So instead of just CompStat, it's CompStat for Justice. And the goal is, community trust, basically. So how can we start tracking and measuring data to hold them accountable, just not for crime, but for the outcomes of police actions on the communities they serve, right? So, this is another example of sort of working together, right? To accomplish this, CPE works directly with the police department and the community, and they identify the drivers of racial disparity, and then they leverage that to work together, okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys.